I want you, for a moment, to imagine that we are not seated in an academic hall, nor bound by the rigid expectations of a modern lecture, but gathered instead in a space closer to the soul, perhaps a stone room near a lake, where silence itself seems to listen. I speak to you now not as a theoretician eager to convince, but as an old man who has watched the psyche reveal its patterns again and again, in dreams, in breakdowns, in moments of quiet withdrawal that the outer world so often misinterprets. When I speak of the empath stepping back from chaos, I do not speak of retreat as weakness, nor of detachment as indifference. I speak of a profound psychic event, one that signals a rupture in an old agreement between the individual and the collective unconscious that once fed upon them. Chaos, in the psychological sense, is rarely what people think it is. It is not merely noise, conflict, or disorder in the outer world. Chaos is the undifferentiated demand of the collective psyche. The pool of unfinished complexes, projections, ancestral wounds, and unconscious expectations that swarm around a sensitive soul. The empath, by temperament or by fate, is often the one whose nervous system becomes the meeting place for these forces. They feel before they understand. They carry before they choose. And for a long time, they mistake this capacity for a moral duty, believing that to withdraw would be to betray love itself. Yet the psyche has its own teleology. It moves, slowly and often painfully, toward wholeness. There comes a moment, and this moment is never announced by trumpets, when the empath no longer collapses under chaos, but begins to perceive it symbolically. What once felt like a personal obligation reveals itself as a pattern, an archetypal role they have been unconsciously playing. At this threshold, stepping back is not an act of avoidance, it is an act of differentiation. The ego, long submerged in the tides of collective need, begins to draw a boundary, and boundaries, contrary to popular belief, are not walls of rejection, they are structures of consciousness. When such a boundary forms, the old world reacts as if something essential has been stolen. Relationships that once flowed effortlessly begin to strain. Systems, familial, social, emotional, that relied on the empath's constant availability start to falter. This is not because the empath has become cold, but because the psychic economy has changed. The old world loses access not to the empath's love, but to their unconscious participation. And it is precisely this unconscious participation that sustained the chaos. In my work with patients, I have seen this moment appear first in dreams. A person dreams of locked doors, of missing keys, of phones that no longer connect, of bridges that collapse just after they have crossed. These are not omens of loss in the vulgar sense. They are symbols of psychic withdrawal. The unconscious announces that a channel has closed. What once flowed automatically now requires consciousness, intention, and choice. The empath, often without understanding why, begins to feel less compelled to explain themselves, to rescue, to absorb what does not belong to them. They may even feel guilt, for guilt is the guardian of old roles, but beneath the guilt lies a deeper sensation, an unfamiliar quiet, sometimes frightening, sometimes liberating. You must understand that the collective does not relinquish its access easily. Archetypal systems resist change. When the empath steps back, projections intensify. They may be accused of selfishness, coldness, abandonment. These accusations are not random. They are the shadow speaking. The shadow, when deprived of a host, seeks to reattach itself through moral language. It says, "You owe us. You have always been this way. Why have you changed?" But the psyche changes precisely because remaining the same would mean stagnation, and stagnation is death to the soul. This is why I insist that withdrawal, at this stage, is not regression. It is a necessary movement toward individuation. Individuation is not the severing of all ties, but the transformation of unconscious bonds into conscious relationships. When the empath no longer serves as a vessel for unexamined chaos, the old world loses its easiest access point. The emotional system must now confront itself, and this confrontation is often experienced as loss, even catastrophe, by those who benefited from the previous arrangement. The empath, meanwhile, stands at a crossroads without chaos constantly flooding their inner life. They may feel strangely empty. Many mistake this emptiness for depression, but it is more accurately described as psychic space, space where new symbols can emerge, space where the self, not the ego, but the deeper organizing principle of the psyche can begin to speak. This is often when people report a renewed relationship with dreams, with images, with a sense of inner authority that does not shout but endures. I want to be very clear. Stepping back does not mean becoming superior to the world. That is another trap of the shadow, this time dressed as spiritual arrogance. The empath who truly withdraws does so with humility, often with sorrow, sometimes with fear. They grieve the loss of who they were allowed to be in the eyes of others. They grieve the familiar chaos, because chaos, too, can feel like home when it has shaped you since childhood. But grief is not a sign of error. It is the price of transition. The old world loses access because access was never meant to be permanent. It was provisional, developmental, and unconscious. What replaces it is not isolation, but a new form of relatedness, one that does not require self-erasure. And here we touch something deeply mythological. In many myths, the hero or the sensitive one must descend into solitude before returning transformed. Think of the hermit, the wounded healer, the one who leaves the village not out of contempt but necessity. This withdrawal is the incubation of a new psychic attitude. If you are listening to me and recognize this movement in your own life, I would caution you against trying to explain it too quickly to others. The psyche does not respond well to premature translation. What is happening within you belongs first to the symbolic realm, not the social one. Let it unfold. Let the dreams speak. Let the discomfort educate you. The old world will attempt to regain access through urgency, drama, and moral pressure. But the self does not operate on urgency. It operates on timing. In the next movement of this reflection, we must descend further into the origins of why the empath was granted such access in the first place, and what it means on a deeper archetypal level when that access is revoked. For now, remain with this image. a door gently closing, not slammed in anger, but closed because the room beyond is being rearranged. The world outside may knock, it may even panic, but something within you knows that this closing is not an end. It is a necessary silence before a truer voice can be heard. There is a question that inevitably arises when we speak of access, of chaos, and of withdrawal, and it is this: why was the empath granted such access to begin with? This is not a sentimental question, nor a moral one. It is a structural question of the psyche. Access is never random. The unconscious does not choose its vessels arbitrarily. It selects according to affinity, according to resonance, according to wounds that have not yet learned their own language. Very often, the empath's early life bears the mark of emotional ambiguity. Love was present, perhaps intensely so, but it was unpredictable, conditional, or fused with anxiety. The child learned, long before conscious thought could intervene, that attunement was survival, to feel the moods of the room, to anticipate the needs of others, to soften conflict before it erupted. These were not strategies chosen by the ego, but adaptations forged by the nervous system. The child did not say, "I will become sensitive." The psyche said, "I must become permeable." And permeability, once rewarded, becomes identity. In such a child, the boundary between self and other remains fluid. This fluidity is not pathological in itself. Indeed, it can lead to remarkable capacities for empathy, imagination, and relational depth. But when the environment repeatedly confirms that harmony depends on the child's self-erasure, a dangerous equation is formed: access equals belonging. The empath grows into adulthood believing, often unconsciously, that to be loved is to be available, that to withdraw is to threaten connection, and that to say no is to invite abandonment. Here we encounter the first shadow. The shadow is not only aggression or selfishness, as is so often misunderstood. The shadow is what conscious thought could intervene. That attunement was survival, to feel the moods of the room, to anticipate the needs of others, to soften conflict before it erupted. These were not strategies chosen by the ego, but adaptations forged by the nervous system. The child did not say, "I will become sensitive." The psyche said, "I must become permeable." And permeability, once rewarded, becomes identity. In such a child, the boundary between self and other remains fluid. This fluidity is not pathological in itself. Indeed, it can lead to remarkable capacities for empathy, imagination, and relational depth. But when the environment repeatedly confirms that harmony depends on the child's self-erasure, a dangerous equation is formed: access equals belonging. The empath grows into adulthood believing, often unconsciously, that to be loved is to be available, that to withdraw is to threaten connection, and that to say no is to invite abandonment. Here we encounter the first shadow. The shadow is not only aggression or selfishness, as is so often misunderstood. The shadow is whatever part of the psyche was disallowed in the formation of the persona. For the empath, the shadow frequently contains firmness, anger, refusal, and indifference. These qualities were not evil, they were simply unsafe to express, and so they were buried, not eliminated. The world, sensing this absence, leans in, it presses where there is no resistance, it enters where there is no gate. Thus chaos gains access, not because the empath invites it consciously, but because the psyche has not yet differentiated between love and intrusion. Chaos, in this sense, is the accumulation of unowned psychic material, others' emotions, unresolved conflicts, collective anxieties that find a temporary home in the empath's openness. Over time, this accumulation becomes exhausting. The empath may experience chronic fatigue, confusion about their own desires, or a persistent sense of being too much and not enough simultaneously. These are not contradictions. They are symptoms of psychic overcrowding. The turning point often arrives not through insight, but through breakdown. The psyche, when ignored, speaks louder. It may manifest as sudden withdrawal, numbness, irritability, or a collapse of the old relational patterns. Friends say, "You've changed." Partners say, "You're not the same person." And they are correct, but what they mourn is not the loss of love, it is the loss of access. They mourn the disappearance of the unconscious function the empath once served. At this juncture, many empaths attempt to return to their former role, driven by guilt or fear. They reopen the gates, hoping to restore equilibrium, but something resists. The psyche, having glimpsed a deeper order, will not easily regress. Attempts to resume the old pattern feel hollow, draining, even unbearable. This is the psyche enforcing its own development. What once worked no longer does, and this failure is not punishment, it is guidance. We must speak here of the self, that central archetype of order and meaning that transcends the ego. The self does not demand sacrifice in the way the collective often does. It demands alignment. When the empath steps back from chaos, they are not defying love, they are aligning with the self's demand for wholeness. The old world loses access because the self has revoked an unconscious permission slip. What remains is a possibility of conscious relationship, but this requires reciprocity, respect, and differentiation qualities not all systems are willing or able to cultivate. Dreams during this period often carry motifs of initiation. One dreams of wandering alone through unfamiliar landscapes, of shedding old skins, of encountering guides who speak little but carry authority. Sometimes there are images of storms subsiding, of waters receding, revealing land long submerged. These are not fantasies of escape. They are maps of psychic reorganization. The unconscious is showing the dreamer that what felt like emptiness is, in fact, emergence, yet the empath may still ask, quietly and painfully, if I am no longer needed in the same way, who am I? This question marks the true beginning of individuation. Identity based on function must give way to identity based on being. This transition is not celebrated by the outer world, for it cannot be easily exploited. A person who knows who they are no longer absorbs chaos unquestioningly. They may still care deeply, but their care no longer dissolves their center. Here, the shadow begins to integrate The empath learns to tolerate others' disappointment without rushing to repair it. They learn that refusal does not annihilate love. They learn, perhaps for the first time, that their inner life has gravity. This gravity alters relationships. Some fall away, others reorganize around the new center, and some, unable to access the empath as before, reveal their own dependence on chaos, control, or unconscious extraction. This revelation can be painful, but it is also clarifying. The empath sees, often with shock, how much of their previous world was sustained not by mutuality but by imbalance. This is not a call to bitterness. Bitterness belongs to the unintegrated shadow. Rather, it is an invitation to realism. The psyche matures through truth, not through endless accommodation. As the old world loses access, a new inner world forms. Solitude becomes less frightening. Silence becomes instructive. The empath may feel drawn to symbols, myths, and creative expressions that were previously drowned out by noise. This is not withdrawal from life, but a reorientation toward depth. The psyche, no longer constantly invaded, can finally listen to itself. In the next movement of our exploration, we must consider what happens when the outer world responds aggressively to this loss of access, and how the empath can remain anchored without collapsing into isolation or retaliation. For now, hold this understanding gently. Chaos did not disappear because you stepped back. It simply lost its easiest doorway. What it does next will reveal much about the structures you are leaving behind and about the strength of the self that is quietly taking shape within you. When the outer world discovers that its familiar pathways are no longer open, it rarely responds with quiet acceptance. More often, it reacts as any threatened system does, with escalation. This escalation can take many forms. It may appear as sudden urgency, emotional intensity, accusations of betrayal, or appeals to shared history. Sometimes it dresses itself in concern, sometimes in anger, sometimes in moral superiority, but beneath all these masks lies a single psychic truth. A structure has lost its unconscious supply. You must understand that many relationships, families, and even institutions are not bound primarily by love or shared meaning, but by implicit psychic contracts. These contracts are never spoken aloud. They are woven in childhood, reinforced through repetition, and sanctified by familiarity. The empath's role within such contracts is often that of regulator, absorber, translator of unspoken tensions. When the empath steps back, the contract does not dissolve quietly, it destabilizes. The system begins to shake because its hidden stabilizer has moved. At this stage, the empath is often tempted to explain. Explanation feels like kindness. It feels like responsibility. If they just understood, the empath thinks they wouldn't react this way. But this is a subtle danger. Explanation offered prematurely often becomes a new form of access. It reopens the gate under the guise of clarity. The psyche senses this immediately, and confusion returns. Fatigue returns. The old pressure seeps back in. There is a deep psychological reason for this. True transformation is not negotiated at the level of explanation. It is registered at the level of behavior and boundary. The unconscious does not respond to arguments. It responds to limits. When the empath holds the boundary quietly, without excessive justification, and sanctified by familiarity. The empath's role within such contracts is often that of regulator, absorber, translator of unspoken tensions. When the empath steps back, the contract does not dissolve quietly, it destabilizes. The system begins to shake because its hidden stabilizer has moved. At this stage, the empath is often tempted to explain. Explanation feels like kindness. It feels like responsibility. If they just understood, the empath thinks they wouldn't react this way. But this is a subtle danger. Explanation offered prematurely often becomes a new form of access. It reopens the gate under the guise of clarity. The psyche senses this immediately, and confusion returns. Fatigue returns. The old pressure seeps back in. There is a deep psychological reason for this. True transformation is not negotiated at the level of explanation. It is registered at the level of behavior and boundary. The unconscious does not respond to arguments. It responds to limits. When the empath holds the boundary quietly, without excessive justification, the system is forced to confront something it has long avoided, its own imbalance, and this confrontation is intolerable for many. This is why withdrawal, when it is authentic, often provokes aggression. The empath may encounter sudden coldness, dismissal, or even character assassination. These are not signs that the empath has done something wrong. They are signs that the shadow has been activated in the other. The shadow, feeling exposed, strikes outward. It says, "You are the problem," because to admit otherwise would require a painful internal reckoning. Here the empath faces a crucial inner task to resist internalizing this projection. For many empaths, this is the most difficult part of the journey. Their early conditioning taught them that conflict means danger, that others' distress is their responsibility. But individuation requires a new psychological posture. It requires the capacity to remain present without absorbing, to witness without rescuing, to feel compassion without surrendering one's center. This posture does not arise overnight. It develops through repeated encounters with discomfort that is no longer anesthetized by overfunctioning. The empath learns, slowly, that another person's anxiety does not automatically signal an emergency. They learn that silence does not equal abandonment. They learn that not everything unresolved must be resolved by them. Each of these realizations loosens the grip of the old world. Dreams during this phase often become darker before they become clearer. One may dream of being chased, judged, or exposed. One may dream of standing before hostile figures or crowds. These dreams are not warnings, they are rehearsals. The psyche is practicing a new stance. It is asking, can you remain yourself under pressure? Can you endure disapproval without collapsing? When the dreamer wakes and does not retreat from these images, a subtle strengthening occurs. Eventually, something shifts in the outer dynamics as well. Systems that depended heavily on the empath's unconscious participation either adapt or disintegrate. Some relationships deepen, becoming more honest, more mutual. Others fade, not because of malice, but because their foundation was never meant to support individuation. This loss can be painful, and it deserves mourning, but It is a different kind of mourning than before. It is not the grief of self-betrayal, it is the grief of outgrowing. At this point, the empath may notice a paradoxical development. While their outer circle may shrink, their inner world expands. Thoughts gain clarity, desires become more discernible. There is a sense of internal alignment that was previously obscured by constant responsiveness. This is the self beginning to exert its quiet authority. The self does not shout, it does not demand recognition, it simply organizes the psyche around a deeper center. This inner authority changes how the empath encounters chaos when it inevitably appears again. For chaos is not eradicated from life, but it is now perceived differently. Chaos is seen as information, not obligation. It reveals where systems are fragmented, where shadows are unintegrated, where responsibility is being displaced. The empath may still feel these currents, but they no longer confuse sensation with duty. Feeling no longer equals caring. This distinction is crucial. Sensitivity is not meant to be synonymous with sacrifice. In a mature psyche, sensitivity becomes perception, and perception allows choice. The empath who has stepped back from chaos can choose when and how to engage. They can say yes without resentment and no without cruelty. This is not detachment in the cold sense. It is relatedness grounded in consciousness. And here we touch upon a profound archetypal shift. The empath moves from the archetype of the sacrificial child to that of the conscious mediator. The sacrificial child gives until there is nothing left, hoping for safety or love in return. The conscious mediator understands that exchange must be reciprocal to be sustainable. This transformation is often invisible to the outer world, but internally it feels like a return to oneself after a long exile. The old world, having lost its easy access, may eventually recalibrate, or it may seek new vessels elsewhere. This is not the empath's concern. Their task is not to manage the world's reaction, but to remain faithful to the inner alignment that has emerged. Fidelity to the self is not dramatic. It is expressed in small, consistent acts of honesty, honoring fatigue, respecting inner signals, refusing to betray one's own experience for the sake of harmony. As this fidelity deepens, the empath may encounter a new kind of fear, not the fear of abandonment, but the fear of responsibility. To live without unconscious access means to live without excuses. One can no longer say, I had no choice. One has choice now, and with choice comes accountability to oneself. This is the true weight of individuation, and it is why many retreat before completing the journey. Yet those who remain discover something quietly miraculous. The world does not end when access is withdrawn, meaning does not disappear. Love does not evaporate. What disappears is exploitation disguised as connection, chaos disguised as intimacy, obligation disguised as virtue. In their place arises something less dramatic but far more enduring. Presence. Presence does not demand attention. It does not rescue or perform. It simply is. And paradoxically, this presence often commands more respect than the old self ever did. Not because it seeks authority, but because it embodies it. The psyche recognizes authenticity the way the body recognizes gravity. In the final movement of this reflection, we must turn inward once more to examine how the empath's withdrawal alters their relationship with meaning, vocation, and the future. How the loss of access from the old world becomes the opening of a deeper path, one that no longer requires chaos to feel alive. When access from the old world is withdrawn, something unexpected often emerges in its place, a confrontation with meaning itself. For many empaths, chaos once provided a strange sense of purpose, to be needed, to be indispensable, to be the one who could feel, hold, and translate what others could not. This role offered direction, even if it came at great personal cost. When that role dissolves, a vacuum appears, and into this vacuum steps a question the empath may have postponed for decades. If I am no longer defined by what I absorb, rescue, or stabilize, what am I here for? This question is not immediately answered by the psyche. In fact, it is often met first with silence. This silence can feel unsettling, even frightening. Many interpret it as loss of direction, or worse, as proof that they have made a terrible mistake by stepping back. But silence, in the language of the unconscious, is not emptiness, it is incubation. It is the quiet of a field after a storm, when the soil, long compacted, finally has room to breathe. During this period, the empath may feel strangely unmotivated by pursuits that once seemed essential, goals tied to approval, validation, or constant engagement lose their emotional charge. This can resemble apathy from the outside, but internally it is more akin to recalibration. The psyche is withdrawing energy from false centers of gravity and preparing to invest it elsewhere. This withdrawal is often misread as depression, yet it lacks the despair and self-reproach characteristic of true depressive states. Instead, there is a watchfulness, a waiting. It is here that vocation, in its deepest sense, begins to whisper, vocation is not career, nor role, nor productivity. It is the particular way in which an individual's psyche wishes to participate in the world without violating itself. For the empath who has stepped back from chaos, as proof that they have made a terrible mistake by stepping back, but silence, in the language of the unconscious, is not emptiness, it is incubation. It is the quiet of a field after a storm, when the soil, long compacted, finally has room to breathe. During this period, the empath may feel strangely unmotivated by pursuits that once seemed essential, goals tied to approval, validation, or constant engagement lose their emotional charge. This can resemble apathy from the outside, but internally it is more akin to recalibration. The psyche is withdrawing energy from false centers of gravity and preparing to invest it elsewhere. This withdrawal is often misread as depression, yet it lacks the despair and self-reproach characteristic of true depressive states. Instead, there is a watchfulness, a waiting. It is here that vocation, in its deepest sense, begins to whisper, vocation is not career, nor role, nor productivity. It is the particular way in which an individual's psyche wishes to participate in the world without violating itself. For the empath who has stepped back from chaos, vocation can no longer be built on constant emotional availability. It must arise from alignment with the self. This alignment feels different. It is quieter, less urgent, but more persistent. It does not shout, "You must," but it repeats gently, "This belongs to you," and goes. Often, this sense of belonging manifests through symbols rather than plans. One feels drawn to certain images, texts, practices, or forms of expression without immediately knowing why. There may be a renewed interest in art, myth, nature, or study not as escape, but as resonance. These attractions are not hobbies in the superficial sense. They are signals. The unconscious is pointing toward forms that can carry the individual's energy without draining it. Dreams, once again, become guides. They may introduce figures of teachers, craftsmen, wanderers, or guardians, archetypes of transmission rather than sacrifice. The empath may dream of building something slowly, tending a garden, restoring an old structure, or carrying a light through darkness without being consumed by it. These images suggest a new relationship to responsibility. Responsibility is no longer synonymous with suffering. It becomes stewardship. This shift has profound implications for the future. The empath who no longer serves chaos unconsciously becomes less reactive to collective fear. While the old world may rush toward urgency, crisis, and polarization, the individuating empath senses when not to rush. This does not make them passive. It makes them selective. They engage where engagement aligns with their center, and they refrain where engagement would recreate old patterns of depletion. Such selectivity can be misunderstood. The world is accustomed to empaths who respond quickly, who smooth over discomfort, who absorb shocks. When that responsiveness becomes intentional rather than automatic, it disrupts expectations. Yet, over time, something remarkable occurs. Those who approach the empath must do so more honestly. There is no longer an unconscious cushion to soften everything. The encounter becomes more real. Internally, the empath's relationship with time also changes. Chaos collapses time into constant immediacy. Everything feels urgent. Everything feels now. When chaos loses access, time expands. There is room for reflection, for patience, for delay. This temporal shift is crucial, for individuation unfolds over time, not through sudden transformation. The psyche needs rhythm. It needs cycles of engagement and withdrawal, of action and rest. The empath who honors this rhythm discovers a steadiness that was previously impossible. This steadiness does not eliminate pain, but it changes its meaning. Pain is no longer evidence of failure or obligation. It becomes information. It signals where something matters, where something is incomplete, where growth is still occurring. The empath learns to listen to pain without immediately trying to fix it either in themselves or in others. This listening is a form of respect, and respect is the foundation of mature relationship. At this stage, one may look back on the old world with a mixture of tenderness and clarity. There is compassion for the version of oneself who survived by absorbing chaos, and compassion for those who depended on that absorption without knowing how to live otherwise. But there is also discernment. Not everything that once felt sacred was truly so. Some bonds were held together by fear, guilt, or unconscious necessity rather than genuine connection. To see this clearly is not cruelty, it is awakening. The empath may also begin to sense a subtle but undeniable confidence. This confidence does not announce itself, it does not seek affirmation, it arises from coherence, thoughts, feelings, and actions begin to align. One's yes and no become trustworthy. This trust in oneself is perhaps the greatest gift of stepping back from chaos. Without it, no amount of empathy can lead to wholeness. And now we arrive at a final, often overlooked consequence of the old world losing access. When the empath withdraws from unconscious participation, they inadvertently invite others to individuate as well. This invitation is not spoken, it is embodied. Some will refuse it, clinging to old patterns, seeking access elsewhere, but others will feel something stir within themselves. They will sense that relationship no longer functions as it once did, and that they must change or withdraw. In this way, individuation is contagious, not through persuasion, but through presence. This is why I say that the empath's withdrawal is not a private act. It has collective implications. Every time an individual refuses to carry what does not belong to them, the collective loses one channel of unconscious discharge. This loss is destabilizing in the short term, but healing in the long term. It forces responsibility back toward its rightful owners. It exposes shadows that can no longer hide behind sensitivity. To live this way is not easier, it is simpler, but simplicity is not clinging to old patterns, seeking access elsewhere, but others will feel something stir within themselves. They will sense that relationship no longer functions as it once did, and that they must change or withdraw. In this way, individuation is contagious, not through persuasion, but through presence. This is why I say that the empath's withdrawal is not a private act. It has collective implications. Every time an individual refuses to carry what does not belong to them, the collective loses one channel of unconscious discharge. This loss is destabilizing in the short term, but healing in the long term. It forces responsibility back toward its rightful owners. It exposes shadows that can no longer hide behind sensitivity. To live this way is not easier, it is simpler, but simplicity is not comfort. It demands ongoing awareness, humility, and courage. The empath must continually ask, "Is this mine?" and be willing to accept the answer, even when it leads to solitude or misunderstanding. Yet within this solitude there is a deep companionship, the companionship of the self. When I speak of the self, I do not speak of perfection or enlightenment. I speak of an inner coherence that allows one to stand in the world without being devoured by it. The empath who steps back from chaos does not disappear. They become more real, and in becoming more real, they render the old world's demands less absolute, less compelling, less tyrannical. So, if you find yourself in this threshold space, no longer willing to absorb, not yet certain where to give, do not rush to define it. Do not pathologize it. You are not broken. You are reorganizing. The old world has lost access because something within you has claimed its rightful authority. This authority is quiet, patient, and enduring. It does not need chaos to feel alive. It does not need sacrifice to justify its existence. It waits calmly for you to grow into it. There is, however, one last region of the psyche we must approach, because many empaths reach this stage and quietly become confused by what happens next. They assume that once chaos loses access, peace should arrive in a complete and permanent form. When it does not, when moments of disturbance still appear, they wonder if they have failed, if they have somehow undone their progress. This misunderstanding itself belongs to the old world's logic, the logic of final states and absolute solutions. The psyche does not work this way. What truly changes when the empath steps back from chaos is not the disappearance of disturbance, but the location of authority. Chaos no longer occupies the center. It becomes peripheral. It passes through the psyche rather than settling there. This distinction is subtle but decisive. Before, chaos defined the empath's inner weather. Now, it becomes a phenomenon observed within a larger psychic sky. This is why I must caution against idealizing calm. Calm, when sought as an outcome, often becomes another form of compulsion. The individuating empath does not aim to feel calm at all times. They aim to remain oriented. Orientation means that when emotion arises, whether sorrow, anger, or fear, it does not immediately dictate identity or action. It is held in awareness, related to symbolically, and allowed to reveal its message. At this stage, many empaths encounter a deeper layer of the shadow, one that is less dramatic but more unsettling. This shadow is not the rage of others, nor the guilt imposed by old systems. It is the empath's own latent will. For a long time, will was suppressed because it threatened harmony. Desire was postponed because it might disrupt others. Now, as chaos loses access, will begins to surface not explosively, but insistently. This can feel disorienting. The empath may notice preferences becoming sharper, tolerances becoming narrower. They may feel less willing to compromise on matters that once seemed trivial. This is not rigidity, it is differentiation. The psyche is clarifying what belongs to the individual and what does not, yet because will was long relegated to the shadow, its emergence can feel unfamiliar, even alarming. Some empaths fear that embracing their will turn them into something harsh or unrecognizable. But will, when integrated, does not dominate. It directs, it gives shape to energy. Without will, empathy disperses endlessly. With will, empathy gains form. It can be applied without self-annihilation. This is a crucial correction in the empath's psychological development. Dreams during this phase may include images of tools, weapons, or instruments not as symbols of violence, but of agency. One may dream of holding a staff, forging metal, steering a vessel, or learning to use an unfamiliar device. These images indicate that psychic energy is no longer purely receptive. It is becoming active, purposive. The empath is no longer only a field in which things happen. They are becoming a participant who can initiate. This initiation brings with it a new ethical challenge. When one no longer absorbs chaos automatically, One must decide how to engage with suffering in the world. Previously, suffering pulled the empath in by force. Now, engagement becomes a choice, and choice introduces moral weight. One cannot be everywhere. One cannot respond to everything. The empath must learn discernment, which is a painful skill because it involves exclusion. Discernment means recognizing that saying yes to one thing requires saying no to another. It means accepting that one's energy is finite. This acceptance often collides with old internalized images of goodness. Many empaths were taught implicitly or explicitly that goodness meant selflessness without limit. Individuation demands a revision of this ethic. Goodness becomes fidelity to truth rather than endless accommodation. This revision does not make the empath indifferent to suffering. On the contrary, it often deepens compassion. But compassion is no longer confused with fusion.